All right, everybody, welcome. You're listening to WRUU LP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings Community Radio with Global Soul, and this is the Adam Messer Show. I'm your host, Adam Messer, and today my special guest is Michele Tracy Berger, and Michele is an author. She's a professor, a pug lover. She has recently just published a new book called Renew You, and she's also known for her short fiction, her poetry, and her creative nonfiction, as well as a lot of other really interesting things that we're going to get into today. So welcome, Michele. Thank you so much for being here on the show today. How are you?
I am well, and thank you so much, Adam, for having me. I'm just delighted to be here and to chat with you today.
I am as well. I know the other day we had a chance to talk for a little bit, like just a little chit chat, and you know, for the folks maybe tuning in for the first time today to the Adam Messer Show, I talk with authors, artists, and entertainers, and I was excited to have the opportunity to talk with you, Michele, because you seem like an interesting person. And, we had a mutual friend refer us, together to talk about, different stuff. So would you mind telling the audience a little bit more about yourself? And we're going to talk like a lot today, but would you give everybody just kind of like the little overview?
Absolutely. So I like to say I write across the speculative fiction universe. So I write everything from science fiction to modern fantasy to magical realism, but everything I write has a horror edge to it. And I will say that I came to embracing horror as a kind of a marker of my work, specifically psychological horror, a bit late in my career, but I'm claiming it. I'm very excited, and what we talked about before was sort of about our love of horror and the horror genre. And I'll also say that I've been writing, I've thought of myself as a creative writer for a very long time. However, it's only been in the last decade or so that I've made really strong efforts to live an inspired creative life. I also am a creativity coach, and I work with other people around helping them to live inspired lives and to take action on their dreams. And that's one of the things that really motivates me, is supporting other creative professionals. So I'm, again, just excited to have this conversation with you because I know that's what you do as well.
Oh yeah. And speaking of creative endeavors, my son Sebastian is a musician, and he's always here. He's actually like my co-host on the show, and he plays live music for us. So Sebastian, would you mind playing a little tune for us today? And this is Sebastian Messer, everybody. Awesome. Thanks, Bass. And he, can you tell us, you just got the new guitar, it's Novation, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. My mom, I'll just give a shout out to my mom. She gave my son a brand new Ovation guitar. And it's like really nice. It's the same kind of guitar Jim Croce played, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's pretty cool. So, hey, Michele,
that was fantastic.
Well, thank you.
I
love having him on the show. He's been playing on the show since I started like 2 years ago, and it's like I think it's just kind of neat to have some live music, as an element of the show. Speaking of creative stuff, Michelle, this is something I've been doing lately with all my guests. Would you like to give a shout out to anybody that might be listening in or that might be listening to the podcast later on?
Oh my goodness! Well, I will give.
And you have the stage,
to...
so you can shout out whoever you want.
I will give a shout out to my writing mentor and dear friend and teacher, Marjorie Hudson, because she supports everything that I do. She's the author of Accidental Birds in the Carolinas, which is a wonderful short story collection, and also Searching for Virginia Dare, which is a wonderful memoir. And later on, I will talk about her influence. And I also will give a shout out to folks who might be listening who know me from my blog, The Practice of Creativity, or my author Facebook page. Thanks for that.
Sweet. Yeah, I love it. I want to give a shout out to, I gave one out to my mom, but I want to give a shout out to her. She's in town visiting, and my Aunt Debbie is in town visiting. And I also want to give a shout out to my very special friends, Terry and Darlene Dremel. They actually, they listen like every week. And they'll send me messages and like say, hey, ask so-and-so this and ask so-and-so that and whatever. So I just want to give a shout out to them and Miss Harriet, who also listens, and all the Isle of Hope listeners out there. Thank you all. And everybody else that's in town that might be catching this right now. Thank you for listening. We really appreciate you. So, Michelle, I really enjoyed talking with you the other day, and I was wanting to ask you. You have this new book, Renew You, and it's a Falstaff Books release. Could you tell us about it? Because it is I'll just read this little blurb, but I'd like you to tell us about it too. So with Renew You, here's a synopsis, everybody. What if a visit to a salon could kill you? What if a product billed as a natural hair relaxer harbored a deadly virus? Renew You is about viruses, the politics of beauty, corporate conspiracy, and an unlikely female hero. So can you tell us about that?
Absolutely. So I will say it is a novella, and it has had a really interesting pathway, let's say, to publication. So I actually wrote Renew You, or started the process a while ago, like more than a decade ago. So well before, it deals with the pandemic, but well before the pandemic we're in now. And it started as a response to something that was a real life issue, which I'll talk about in a minute. So the story itself is set in the 1990s. It involves two main protagonists. One is a young woman, a biracial young woman in her late 20s. Her name is Kat, and she is a ski instructor, and she comes back to New York to pack up her deceased mother's things. And she uses a product called Renew You, which is it's billed as a healthy, natural hair care relaxer. And the second character is Constancia, and she's a young Puerto Rican woman with she's very excited about going to college. She's got a bit of a chip on her shoulder, and she also uses this product. And the story unfolds as those two narrators come together to try to figure out what is going on. So they use this product, and then they start to have rashes appear and various other negative things. And then it's set in the 1990s, so they're trying to find out, along with particularly other women of color who are going to the doctor, and it sort of shows up as a skin rash and is originally misdiagnosed. So as the story unfolds, the reader gets the experience of the sense of like what is really going on, how do these characters cope, and it becomes this larger pandemic issue. And in it, I really wanted to explore both what are the things that women have historically done. Like I always say to people, everyone does something with hair. Hair is also very gendered, it's very racialized, but everyone, many, many people, let's just say, whether you get your hair cut, you get your hair washed, you get your hair dyed, you get your hair treated, everyone does something with hair, right? It's just part of the human experience. Not so much talked about in science fiction and fantasy. And so as the story moves on, these women, Kat and Constancia, work together to try to find out and uncover what are the origins of this virus. And so it's based on, like I said, my actual kind of interesting response from the 1990s. So in the 1990s, and your audience might, if they're old enough, sort of remember this. This was the beginning of where a lot of products were billed as natural or organic.
Yeah, I think that was
actually,
like the early days of when people were starting to say organic on anything, and it's like, oh, it's better for you because it's organic. I think, like, especially in the 90s, it really started kind of taking off. And then natural, it's like, oh, if it's natural, it's got to be good,
Absolutely. And so there was this actual product that was marketed, and I remember the infomercial. I never used the product, but literally, I recreate this in the book. Literally, the infomercial had models dipping their fingers in this, what looked like pudding, basically, and said, "It's so good, you can eat it." And a year later, this is the early 90s, so about a year or two later, it came out. There was a class action lawsuit put together by mostly women of color, but not exclusively, basically challenging the product, the basis of the product, because what happened is that women's scalps started peeling, they were burned. I mean, like, really, really terrible things. So, as I was watching all this unfold, I thought, oh, wouldn't it be interesting if I could play with that idea? Because, there's sort of corporate responsibility issues, and what the class action lawsuit revealed was that there really weren't any quote unquote healthy or organic products in that particular mix, right? And so
it's like something like they're like, we're gonna put tar in this and call it natural because it comes from the ground type stuff.
Right.
You're like, wait a minute.
Or, yeah, right. And they,
or like crude oil. They're like, it's natural.
Right. And they touted it as being like from Brazil. And so anyway, and I think all good speculative fiction asks what if questions. And so I tried to say, what if this happened, not necessarily in this way, but what if a virus, was kind of transmitted through this everyday product? And also, the other thing I think, I kind of play with or hint at, it's right before the rise of the internet, and it's right before the rise of cell phones. So I kind of like playing with conspiracy theories, and also the fact that, if people think about, if they were around in the 80s, we didn't actually, when HIV/AIDS came on the scene, we actually for a long time did not know a lot about that virus, right? And so I like playing with this idea of, what are the ramifications where you can't communicate with people as easily, and what happens. But really the core of it is these women having to come together and unpack what's happening. So I like to tell people, I'll just say a little bit about science fiction. Love science fiction. I love, there's a lot of great things that are happening in terms of movies and media, but a lot of times, at least from when I was growing up, when you would see science fiction, you would see, like, if they had an ensemble cast, Adam, they'd have like a bunch of guys and one woman, right? And Wonder Woman is like that. And I love Wonder Woman. Don't get me wrong. I've seen it twice. I love it. But it's like, it's a lot of guys and one woman. And then also, if you think about historically other kinds of movies, it'll be like a lot of white folks and one black character. And so for me, I wanted to play against that trope and sort of have women coming together as friends. They're not friends at the beginning of the novella, but kind of coming together because of this crisis, and kind of using that collective female friendship and collective insight, and kind of, trying to deal with these issues. So that was a fun, there's a lot of edges to play with.
Yeah, that's good. Hang tight for just a second. Everybody, you're listening to WRUULP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul. This is the Adam Messer Show, and I'm your host, Adam Messer. And my special guest today is Michele Tracy Berger. And Michele, so I agree with you. I feel like we live in a time now where it's still, people are still underrepresented in spec fiction, science fiction, stuff like that, Hollywood, things like that. And I feel like it is important to open the playing field up. I really do. I feel like it's important because there's a lot of stuff out there that people are doing, that it's interesting and it's different. And I know, for example, like with comic books and, sci-fi movies and stuff like that, they try to, well, I mean, really, they try different things, different things work, some things, don't work, and it always comes back to the, the bottom line. It's like what sells or what's a shelf warmer, And so I think it's interesting too, because when you have products that sell, people that are willing to support it, it's like the market's going to let things rise up and support it. And it's hard, when what's been selling is like, just for example, with the Marvel movies, right?
Mm-hmm.
To try to pitch something that would be different than like a Marvel movie, you can look at, like, for example, Justice League. You look at how Justice League was received versus like the Avengers. And because
Right.
Justice League, it still follows the, Hollywood format, and things like that. But to try to break that mold that Marvel is, kind of cast on the movie industry, and they've been very successful with it, it's difficult. So how would you or what are some of the steps that you think people can take to try to help support other things that, maybe they're not accustomed to seeing, or, like with the diversity or the change, like, okay, you're doing this from, a female person of color perspective on some issues that actually happen in real life, but you also incorporate, like spec fiction stuff too. So what are some of the things that, that you feel like we can do, or some of the things that, that need to happen type things?
I love that question. It's such a great question. So I think that we have to give readers and viewers a lot more credit than we usually do. I think Hollywood tends to be a much more risk adverse, as you're kind of saying. They tend to be more risk adverse under the guise of, well, this may not sell. But we know, like when we look at Get Out or Black Panther, we know that there's, that actually I think readers, and I'll just say, I'll talk about Hollywood first and then more fiction. People are hungry for the human experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think actually there's and the full human experience, which includes, lots of different kinds of people that haven't been as represented in kind of, let's say, mainstream Hollywood speculative fiction, science fiction films. So, for example, and you probably heard this, but it might be putting in context for your listeners. So with Jordan Peele and Get Out, there was just this standard idea that you could not cast a black male lead for a horror movie. Like, and it was sort of it was stated, but it was also then at times, this unquestioned assumption. I don't know what Jordan Peele had to do to get that movie greenlighted, but he did. And obviously we see, we see the phenomenal success of that, which has given horror a kind of a renaissance.
Mm-hmm.
People are looking now, they're talking about elevated horror, this horror that is moving away, as much as you might like, from slasher kind of films, but to tackling, bigger kind of conceptual issues like Us, Get Out. There's lots of other examples out there, but, Jordan Peele is a good model for that. So I think we have to think that our audiences are actually much more sophisticated and hungry, and make it clear every time we go to see something or buy something, we're making it clear about what our choices are. And so I think making sure that people support these films by a range of creators is really important, because that then models to Hollywood. And I think Hollywood is in this, major transition now. I mean, I'm old enough to have seen, yet this is like maybe the third of like, oh my goodness, we're not really meeting the needs of a broader audience. And oh my goodness, stories about lots of different kinds of people sell. But I think continuing to support those endeavors. Now, for fiction, I would just say, when we look in the fiction world, there's always been writers writing about lots of different kinds of stories, right? And I mean, the way I came of age in college and got introduced to science fiction, speculative fiction, fantasy was actually through a lot of feminist work, like people like Margaret Atwood, Ursula Le Guin, Marge Piercy, feminist writers who were writing science fiction and challenging the norms, and then that became kind of that kind of opened up the landscape. So, and there were also women of color writing and people like Samuel Delany. So I actually think the fiction for science fiction, speculative fiction, and when I use, just for people listening, when I use speculative fiction, I'm talking really the whole umbrella of like horror, magical realism, all of it. So there's actually been people writing for a very long time out there, but now they're just getting their work elevated. So people like Nendia Corafor, who is if you don't know her, she's a wonderful author. People are revisiting the works of Octavia Butler. So I think for people who are interested, just Googling, diverse voices in science fiction, speculative fiction, and then supporting those authors if those authors aren't ones that because there's really a treasure trove of folks writing. But we have to be, as consumers, we have to be mindful too of what are the kinds of stories we're consuming and be willing to venture further out.
I think that's an important point. Not just spec fiction or anything like that, anything creative really, any kind of
Absolutely.
indie project, I think, and this is one of the things that I see a lot is when you have a niche, how do you say it? And when you have a really laser focused group that, like when you're talking about the feminist group or whatever, when you have a laser focused group inside of that circle, there's going to be a lot of awareness, right? And then it's like, how do you penetrate the mainstream awareness? Because, Disney is successful because of a lot of reasons, but one of the biggest reasons is because they appeal to a general audience, right? And so when they I'll give an example. When they took over Marvel, the Marvel movies were, like the 70s and 80s movies, not really that great. The cartoons were really popular, but even those were like, whatever. They had the X-Men movies through Sony. The Marvel X-Men movies were through Sony, and, those are, kind of groundbreaking for an X-Men movie. And I think Hugh Jackman did a great job with Wolverine. But what I see happening is like when different groups, for example, I'm in a pulp fiction group because, I write stuff, and I'm in a lot of different writing groups or author groups, but I'm in a pulp fiction group, and the topic came up where James Patterson apparently is going to be writing a character called the Shadow. And some of the people in that group, now this is kind of like the example I'm talking about with a smaller group, it's kind of like, I don't want to call it an echo chamber, but it's kind of like that, like, and because you get a lot of the same side of viewpoints, right? And
right.
But there were people that were like really against it, and there were other people that are like really for it. And my opinion was that, if you got a guy like James Patterson who's going to be reviving a character that has been around for a long time, that it would have a ripple effect on other pulp fiction authors, and it's going to, bounce out. And so when you're talking about like, different movies, like, Black Panther, for example, $1 billion movie. Nobody expected a $1 billion movie, and it broke all of those expectations. Like it created a whole new realm of cosplay, a whole new realm. And Black Panther's been around for a long time. But this movie opened up a whole new realm of superheroes to kids who are normally seeing like Superman or Batman or, Wonder Woman or whatever. So how do we break out of those, those niche groups and, transition and say, hey, this is something that you might not be used to, or something different, but how do we bridge that gap?
Well, I think there's a couple of different pieces to that. And one, I hope we can come back to writing community, because I think it'd be interesting for us to talk about the importance of writing community, whether we sometimes disagree with our writing community, but that's an important place. I want to put that in, I like to say, put it in the parking lot, so we make sure we can get back to that. I think there's a difference, too, also between fandom, right? Because fans actually, at least in genre fiction, particularly in the science fiction world, have driven historically, and in romance to some degree, but most especially in science fiction, have been have helped to drive ideas about what they're reading, what they're doing, what they like. So I think sometimes fans also can not always be as supportive around new ways of thinking about characters. Now,
Yeah, fans can be toxic sometimes, definitely.
Yeah, so that's a complicated, like, for example, when Doctor Who, which I have not, one of my gaps. I'm not a Doctor Who devotee. Have not followed Doctor Who, but with the innovations that Doctor Who has made in terms of the TV show with the characters, there's been a lot of pushback. So I think that's an interesting piece too. Now, in terms of this idea of kind of general, I would just say that we need to really be careful of how we conceptualize general audience, because actually that kind of, sometimes that can be used to erase people's experience. So like when, I think this is a good example, not so much in the sci-fi, but a new film that they just released on Netflix that I'm going to blank on the title, but it's an action adventure film. It's the first action adventure big budget film directed by an African American woman, Gina Price Blythewood, who did Love and Basketball, which was very successful, and a couple of other smaller films. She talked about, so it was just released on Netflix, and I will think of the title in just a moment, but she talked about, the sense of like this idea that, somehow women don't like action adventure films, even though we know from marketing research that women will go to action adventure films by themselves and or with a friend and or, with their boyfriend or husband. But it's sort of this idea that the general audience wants this. And so I think part of the...
Oh, no, I don't mean action adventure film as a general audience. I'm talking about like G films, like G-rated films, where it's... Yeah, not when I say general audience, I'm talking about G-rated films, general audience films. I'm not talking about like who's in that population. I'm talking about like something that anybody can watch with anybody.
Right. Well, I still think I think though that the people who tend to make those decisions sometimes have ideas about what can be shown and who can show it, right? But I do.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of gatekeepers out there.
Yeah,
definitely a lot of
absolutely.
gatekeepers. We have to do our station break. So I like that idea of the parking lot thing. I always call it tabling it, but yeah, I like that. We're gonna park a couple of those thoughts in the parking lot, y'all, and we're gonna come back to it. And I like the opportunity to be able to ask you this, because it is interesting to shake it up a little bit. I mean, it's like, who wants to see the same thing over and over again or read the same thing over? I don't eat the same dinner every night.
Absolutely.
I like to check out new stuff, and and I've got one I want to talk about too after this, talking about something new and different. But
wonderful.
Yeah, and I think you'll dig it too, because she is a really cool lady. That I just actually was introduced to her as well, just like you. So, everybody, you are listening to WRUULP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings Community Radio with Global Soul. And please stay tuned. We've got some station ID announcements right now.
This is a message from the Georgia State Department of Public Health. When the Georgia Department of Public Health gets a lab-confirmed case of COVID-19, they will let the public know. The Georgia Department of Public Health updates its website, dph.ga.gov, every day at noon with a map of confirmed cases around the state of Georgia. More information can be found at dph.ga.gov.
WRUULP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM. wruu.org. We are Savannah Soundings Community Radio with Global Soul.
This portion of WRUU Savannah Soundings programming is brought to you by listeners and the Ships of the Sea Museum. The wait is over. The Ships of the Sea Museum has reopened. Learn about the West Broad Street School, the first publicly funded school for Black children in Savannah. See one of 2 surviving weather kiosks in the country. And Ships of the Sea new Tour Buddy app allows everyone to discover what makes Savannah, Savannah. More information can be found at shipsofthesea.org.
How many times have you heard WRUU's corporate underwriting message? If you remember it, then your potential customers will remember your message as well. We are offering this space to connect corporate and institutional partners with our loyal and active listeners. Underwriting on WRUU is short, so listeners don't tune out. It's exclusive, so your message won't be lost in advertising clutter. And it supports Savannah's only community radio station. For a marketing package to increase your reach beyond traditional media, email underwriting at wruu.org.
All right, we are back, everybody, and thank you for tuning in today. I just want to piggyback off of the call for donations and underwriting. We're an all-volunteer community radio station, and listeners like you with generous and giving donations. That's how we do this here. That's how I'm able to have guests like Michele Berger, on the show with me today and be able to talk about her writing and the changing face of the writing community and what's going on. So please consider making a donation. You can go on to wruu.org if you are a business and you would like to underwrite. The difference between underwriting and advertising is, one, you're helping a community radio station. That's all. It's all volunteer. 2, there's no call to action to buy something or to sell something. So it's all informative. So if that's like your thing, if you like public radio like us, community radio, and you look for customers and clients that enjoy the same kind of thing, check us out, wruu.org. So thank you very much. Okay, so Michele, back at the conversation at hand. So would you continue, please?
Yes. So, we were sort of thinking through how is this moment important about the changing face of voices that have not been included, so to speak. And I think this is a really powerful moment for both people who are creators. There's also recognition, something I wanted to bring up on the publishing side. Publishing itself has gone through a lot of soul searching, as a lot of research has shown that publishing, in terms of who makes the decisions, you're acquiring editors, agents, marketing people, it's like 95 to 97% white historically, and primarily white women. And so publishing has really had to look at how has that affected the kinds of stories that get elevated, that get promoted. And they're going through, particularly, I think this is true across publishing, but particularly in genre fiction, kind of evaluating, how do they make choices? So we were talking a little bit about that, and then also kind of this idea of the general, the general audience and how people think about that general audience. And we both
I was asking with that how we can breach that gap, like when it's a niche market or a niche group, like with like the pulp fiction thing, or like when you're talking about being in a feminist group, it's like, how do you bridge that gap? Because there are going to be people that automatically they hear feminists, or they hear pulp fiction, or they hear horror or whatever. I have friends of mine that as soon as I say, hey, I've got a new horror story, not interested. They're going to automatically tune that out. So how do we bridge that to a general audience where it is appealing to, a wider audience? That's what I was trying to ask with that question.
Yeah, and I think that's also about, so there's a degree of marketing, and I think there's a degree from the author side. I think there's a degree of saying, what kind of reader experience. So, if you're in a face-to-face situation, then some of it is like if you're at a con, which hopefully they will return one day. And I know you've produced literary events, and I know we want those to return in a safe way. But if you're in a face-to-face experience, then it's asking people, well, what kind of reader experience do you want to have today? And then depending on what you actually have available to sell them or to share with them, so a lot of times I don't lead with that my story is really not a hard novel. It's not a hard novella, but I will say if you're interested in, kind of a fast-paced thriller virus kind of story with strong female characters, even for people who are not sci-fi lovers, that might draw them in, right? Because the strong female characters is one piece, or highlighting sort of diverse characters. So I think it depends on if you're talking about the author side or the publishing side. I think for some people are not ever going to. They have tastes that are, I would say, very, very strict, right? So, but you see this with people like Margaret Atwood. For the longest time, Margaret Atwood did not claim to be a speculative fiction author. She was a literary author, right? Mm-hmm. But people claimed her, and then that became, her reader base grew exponentially. And so I think it depends on if you're, from which side you're talking about. Because I think from the author side,
I'm talking about specifically for us indie creators. Mm-hmm. That's the side. Right. Because that's what we're talking about. So that's what the angle that I'm talking about, not the the broad it could be anything and everything angle. For us, like people like us. How do we bridge that gap? Because obviously I'm a white guy and I'm writing horror fiction or whatever. You're an African American female and you're writing horror and spec fiction and stuff like that. And I love my wife and I love my daughters and and I'm pro feminist stuff, but I'm not a feminist. I don't know that I could call myself a feminist in that regard because I'm not a woman, but I can understand the aspects and I can understand the reasons why things should be equal and fair and just. And I also see that there's a lot of things that aren't, but I also know that when somebody says feminist or if they have a certain term or whatever, like some people, they're just going to automatically turn that off. They're not going to say, well, they're trying to talk about like diversity or they're trying to talk about inclusion or they're trying to talk about, whatever. And that's what I'm asking is like, how do we get beyond those labels and just connect with that human condition with other people and then get that message out to other folks? That's, I guess to dive a little deeper.
Yeah. So, I think one, feminism, I'm a women's and gender studies scholar and professor, so I would say feminism is for everybody. And feminism is, if you believe in issues of equality, then, you are a feminist and want to work on behalf of that equality across gender specifically, but also race and class. So, men, women, people who don't identify as male or female, lots and lots of people identify as feminists and can be feminists in various ways. So I think part of what you're asking is this sense of how do we deal with people who have a certain reaction to a term, right? So I just try to write work. I try to write a lot of different kinds of work, and some people, may like my work. They may label it a certain way. They may not like my work, and that's fine. I think at the larger level, the field is just definitely changing. So I think that for people who might have a certain reaction of like, well, I don't want to read X around these kinds of things, they're going to find that maybe their choices are much more narrow because, it's not necessarily just people who identify as people of color who are writing like about or trying to lift up certain kinds of stories. There are plenty of white women and white guys writing diverse characters, right? So I think it's really part of the shift, the actual shift. And I'll just say in the world that we work in, the people who are publishing great horror, they're looking and promoting different kinds of stories. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't a place for kind of a traditional quote-unquote horror story, whatever that looks like, but what is being published now and what is being produced is much broader than it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So I guess my response is more like, well, for some people, they may be missing out on some of the best work that's out there, to be quite honest, right?
Yeah.
So
that was my reaction with the James Patterson thing. I was like, this guy's doing what we want to do. And when I say we, I mean like indie publishers or indie authors or, small publishing authors or whatever. He's doing what we've done. He's cracked the code. He's figured out how to do this. And, and any one of us, and I don't know anybody that would say, no, I don't want to, I'd turn down a deal with, whatever. I don't know anybody that would generally say that is, sincere about their career as an author. If you have a chance to if I, for example, if I had a chance to, partner up with you on a project or whatever, I'd be like, oh yeah, I would love to,
yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yes.
But that's the kind of thing. It's like, why? And I feel like, when I think about like the issues, and I just got into publishing the last couple of years, it's really mind blowing to me the amount of gatekeepers that there are. And I'm like, we're in an indie world. You can publish whatever you want. The gatekeepers are, they're holding on to like a hand of sand that's being blown in the wind. It's like, there's nothing there, but they're still holding on to these old, the old guard stuff. And the reason why I say that is because, excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm all choked up here. But no, the reason why I say that is because I think about sports, for example. When I was a kid, I grew up loving baseball. I listened to the Reds on the radio every day. Now, I was born in 76. Okay. Started listening to baseball in probably 1987. All right. So if I had been born 30 years before, and I'd listened to baseball 30 years before, I wouldn't have seen the same baseball that I grew up loving.
Right.
And that's what I see with the changing face of media, and and I say media because really, storytelling is storytelling. But when I say media, I'm not talking about news or whatever. I'm talking about in general, storytelling representation, TV, movies, radio, whatever. And I think about that. I'm like, okay, well, people, if they're not going to be open to saying something, it's kind of like somebody, just like automatically turn something off for no reason.
Right. And I think, for the artistic experience, I read across, I'll basically read just about anything. I read, I read to learn. I read for pleasure. I read for research. I read things that I don't quite understand why I don't like it. I try to figure out why I don't like it. So I hear you, and I hear the passion in your voice. And to me, that's to understand the world is changing in ways that are complicated. They're changing in ways that sometimes we don't really understand, and that's to me why we look for interesting work to be challenged by, and as well as we return to tropes that we enjoy, right? So I mean that's part of some aspect of genre fiction. So with The Shadow, going back to your example, I mean I'm sure they're drawing on some of the tropes of Pulp Fiction, but they are going to innovate, right? And it sounds like that's part of what we want. We want that continued innovation. And some people don't. I mean, some people they resist that, right? I mean, that's part of the, challenge, or they may be suspicious of Patterson's model. We haven't talked a lot about the whole publishing, the idea of publishing and succeeding as a writer is very different now than it was 20 years ago.
Oh,
right?
yeah,
and
definitely.
So that's, yeah.
Definitely. Well, and that's the thing. You could talk about the nuance of whatever, all day. There's minutia upon minutia upon minutia about whatever, right? And so the thing is with something like that, and I was just trying to use that as a specific example of like, okay, this is a small group. There's going to be a lot of the same ideas being echoed or bounced around, people thinking the same way. And you see that over and over and over with any group. Like in academia, they talk a lot about, groupthink, and making sure that you're not, falling prey to, groupthink with folks. And I feel like that's what happens a lot with stories and publishing, and, people kind of just get caught up in their own, drinking their own tea, basically. And, they like their own, their own stuff. And, real quick,
we might need to find you some different groups, Adam.
Oh, I got a bunch of groups. I mean, I'm in like 30 different writing groups right now, and
wow,
yeah,
that's a really broad writing community.
I'm actually mainly a nonfiction reader though, but I like to write fiction. But I do want to talk about something. Talking about something different and innovative. Next week, Michelle Cornwall Jordan is going to be on my show talking about her. It's a movie series called When Androids Dream. And so it's talking about sci-fi. It'd probably be right up your alley because if you like sci-fi and that kind of stuff, she and her crew just released this When Androids Dream. It was released on Friday, and it's an indie film production. And they broke it down into they made like an episodic movie. That's what they did. But the neat thing about it was that, and I don't want to give any spoilers away, but the neat thing about it was that this is the second movie in the series. The first one was called Monstrum, and so I actually. I like to support other indie creators, and I actually bought both series. It's on Vimeo or whatever, Vimeo or whatever. And that was one of the appeals for me. Was like, this is something different. This is something like I love to see something new or something different. And it was, it's when you're talking about like the demographics of who is portrayed on screen or in books or whatever. Had a leading female African American character. She was the lead in both movies. You had a very diverse group of actors in both movies, and the plot was not like a typical. I mean, like it follows a plot line. I'm not saying it's like disjointed and not following like the typical plot line of a story.
Right.
But the plot was not the oh gosh, there's a problem, and the captain's got to save the day, and that kind of thing. And they think that everything's gonna it's just like the ship's gonna blow up. And all. It wasn't like that. It wasn't like that at all. And there was a lot of like action, and there was also a lot of like drama. And some like how do you call it, like not a how do you call it, a twist or whatever, not like a terse, gosh, I'm trying to think of the word, like when like let's say you and I were lovers, and then we broke up, and then we had like, we still had that that romance feeling for each other, but we kind of hated each other. What do they call that? Right. It was like that kind of I can't remember the name of it. I don't know, but it's like that, and it was great. And I was like, oh my gosh. But, talking about like different things, in the publishing world and, movies and stuff like that, I want to see more of that. I want to see, more of different stuff, like, I mean, when I say different, I'm like, I just mean like not mainstream necessarily, I mean, I'm not saying this. I want to see all African American movies or all Asian movies or whatever, because there's like very little of any people of color stuff, unless you're really looking for it. It just it doesn't get playtime. It doesn't get boosted to the forefront. Like, hey, this is the leading movie or whatever, and I'd like to see more of that.
Well, I think your example is a great one. And I'll just say, I remember the title for people who might want to see the film on Netflix. It's called The Old Guard. And it's by Gina Price Blythewood. But to your example, Yeah, the indie, the indie world has also been a place for movies and for films to kind of develop much more organically, and then they find an audience, and then there's kind of this clamoring, and then it kind of moves to maybe a bigger production. But yeah, I am absolutely with you. A great movie that you might want to check out is called Jennifer Fang. The director is Jennifer Fang, I believe, Phang, and the movie is called Advantageous. And I think it's the first and only all Asian American directed and acted sci-fi film. And it started as first a very small film, and then it became, it went through a process that you're talking about. So it was a really short film, and then it got expanded, and now it's been shown in a lot of places. It's more word of mouth to some degree, but I think you can get it. Maybe you get it now through Netflix. But anyway, it's a wonderful. It's a mother and daughter. It's set in the future, and it's basically about what happens if you can move your consciousness into another body, and what does that mean for relationships and that kind of thing. But it's really told through this mother-daughter lens. So it sounds like this guest that you're going to have on next week is phenomenal. And I think indie publishing is, also where a lot of innovation has happened, right? And you know this because you've been in that community, and you're seeing that now, both as a publisher. There are things risks I think that indie publishers and indie writers can take that allow for different kinds of stories to emerge, that is just it's not as easy for bigger publishers to take that on, because I want to just interject real quick with that. Yeah,
I think that what you just said, it's not as easy for them to take it on. I believe that that's part of the, and I'm not saying that this is your belief, okay, but I believe that is also part of the problem, because they don't allocate money towards new IP development like that.
Right.
Like, it is a problem because they just don't address it. It's a problem because they don't tackle it, and they're not willing to take that chance on, a new IP, intellectual property. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be like, corporateese here, but they're not willing to, give, and that's one of the things that, like, in the comic book world, for example, I want to see more diverse characters. Give them their own book. Give them their own character line. Don't just rebrand a character that's been out for the last 60 or 70 years and say, oh, here it is. Give this other character their own opportunity to have, their own book, to have their own story or movie or whatever. And in the publishing world, I agree with you. Like small print publishing, one of the reasons why I decided to go with small print publishing, not only just for myself as an indie author, but also for working with other authors. I have award-winning authors. I have published authors. I have indie authors on my anthology that's coming out. I have people that are professionals that have been doing this for 20 and 30 years. People like yourself, who you're not in this anthology, but people like yourself who are professionals, and they take their craft seriously. And the reason why I wanted to go with small print publishing is because I wanted to be able to say, hey, you know what? Why don't we work together and help each other out? And so that's a big, I feel like that's a big call for trying to say, hey, this is how we bridge that gap, is by actually saying, you know what, wait a minute. Well, why are the gatekeepers still saying that this isn't good enough? Why can't we?
Well, right.
And I get the whole thing about like, whatever sells is what they go with. I get that, where, the money flows where the eyes go. I get that whole thing. But you know what? If you don't ever put it out there, how are you going to know if it's going to sell?
That's right. Well, so two things. It's both the historically mainstream publishers focus a lot on debut authors.
And we have about 30 seconds left, too. So we're going to wrap this over into the next hour, but continue, please.
Okay. Yeah, so they focus on debut authors, and they put a lot of money behind debut authors, and they don't think about the longevity. So if your debut novel flops,
No big deal.
Times,
Who cares, right?
Yeah, right.
Like, we didn't give you any money anyway, so there you go.
Right. Well, right, but if they put a lot of money into it and it flops, it makes it much more difficult. And I think indie publishers don't think about just the launch. They think about, as you're saying, the longevity of a novel or a set of stories.
I look at it too, we really got to wrap it up real quick, but I look at it too as an opportunity to make new friends and build new relationships with people.
Yeah.
It's just, I think that's a big thing. And when you're talking about like corporate versus, the individual, I feel like that's a huge advantage that the individual has over a corporation, because you have that chance to really focus on the relationship, because you're not dealing with 1,000 people. You're dealing with, one person or 2 people or 10 people, so. Yes. And when we come back, I'll tell the story of my novella, because it was actually at a different place. Nice. Before Falstaff book. Awesome. Okay. So everybody, thank you for tuning in. You are listening